our project, we've examined urban transformations and developmental pressures in Montreal from the perspective of 3 Ontario students as visitors in the city. Our research has been organized along 2 axes, firstly examining the university and its mutation from its principal role as purveyor of knowledge to an urban developer, and secondly, the consequential socio-spatial implications that arise from these transformations. Our presentation is a point of departure, which we hope will initiate a dialogue on the role that universities play in the formatting of urban space and the consequential but increasingly more urgent impacts they make on society as a whole.
From the 19th century model of the university as a town and gown enclave to the 21st century urban innovator, the university's relationship with the city has always been in flux. Unlike many corporations that relocate due to outsourcing, mergers, and liability reductions, universities are enduring components in the development of our cities. During a time of economic downturn, global austerity, and public disinvestment in infrastructure and social services, universities and their real estate developments have become increasingly important to the urban economy.
In Montreal, as with most post-industrial knowledge-based economies, universities, due to their unprecedented expansion through megaprojects, are significantly shaping the form and function of the city. Megaprojects, whether driven by public or private actors, are a means of channeling investment into specific locations in an effort to develop the urban fabric and promote economic growth. These developments involve multi-level stakeholders representing diverse agendas. Canadian universities, which are part of the emergence of institutional developers, operate somewhere in between public and private, often creating new tensions and opportunities between serving their mission of advancing knowledge and addressing the concerns most relevant to the neighboring residents.
So against this backdrop, our research project explores the ways in which Montreal's universities have adopted the role of an urban developer, both historically and progressively in contemporary contexts. Montreal is the home of 4 urban universities: Concordia, McGill, Université de Montréal, Université du Québec à Montréal, often framed under the project of urban renewal and economic revitalization. Mega projects have become developmental strategy amongst these universities. While there are successful examples, such projects, which succeed in attracting external private capital, meeting immediate infrastructural demands, raising their public profile by way of Imagineering, there have also been failed projects, often owing to systemic cost overruns, which are met with massive socioeconomic consequences and public disapproval.
Canadian universities draw from American and English traditions. The growth of education provision mirrored that of the United States, though operate through a simpler system. Universities in Canada are under the provincial jurisdiction, and by 1974, provincial and federal funding amounted to 70% of all of universities' operating budgets. Major Canadian innovations in university planning paralleled England's new universities of the 1960s, privileging integration into the cities. Spearheaded by architects such as Arthur Erickson and John Andrews, the North American campus, as random separate buildings for separate students, was replaced for the model of one world, one university, and one building. This model rejected traditional separation of faculties and departments into individual buildings. Interdisciplinary work was fostered through connectivity and shared facilities, for example, the Simon Fraser University and the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. After the 1964 band session on campus architecture, Thomas Howarth stated, "Almost overnight, the Canadian University has become a major patron of the architectural profession. Between 1957 and 1967, 11 new universities and colleges were established in Canada. This massive expansion was due to shifts in societal values that began to view education as a collective responsibility for a modern nation citizen."
So we're going to briefly go through the 19th century universities, McGill and UDM. And we really feel that McGill exemplifies the tension between private and public throughout its history. So beginning with James McGill, the benefactor, he was a Scottish immigrant who acquired much of his 45-acre Burnside estate by the early 1800s, and this estate was located on the outskirts of Montreal. He and his wife had no children and bequeathed in trust this estate and £10,000 to the Royal Institution for the Advancement of Learning, which was Quebec's first version of a public education system. According to historian Stanley Frost, James McGill believed that a strong country had its roots in trade and education, and he wanted to contribute toward this end in Canada. So we'll see this emphasis between education and economics throughout McGill University's phases of growth. In 1821, McGill College received a royal charter from King George IV, and McGill was officially established in that year. Then in 1852, Queen Victoria amends this charter by King George IV and makes the school independent of the crown and folds the public Royal Institution for the Advancement of Learning into the university as its board of governors. So McGill remained primarily an independent and somewhat private institution until the mid-50s. Historian Stanley Frost is quoted as saying, "McGill is unique in that it was a public institution forced to become a private one. It had not chosen private status and had never been averse to receiving government grants, and had indeed assiduously sought them, because particularly in the 50s, the matter was become a question of survival." Then later in the 60s, McGill principal Frank Cyril James said, "In every country in the world today, men believe that higher education has a significant influence on economic development. This belief underlies the worldwide demand for the expansion of university institutions, and it also justifies the steadily growing demands on the public purse to finance this development." Until about the 1960s, McGill was the only university in Quebec to have an endowment, and this caused some difficulty for the university to secure government aid in the early 50s. Another dynamic sort of contributing to McGill's this sort of tension between public and private was that its location was right beside the Golden Square Mile, which contained 75% of all Canadian wealth until the early 20th century. Then a combination of war, global economic factors, political instability, etc., caused some of this wealth to leave. So today, the spatial dynamic of both McGill and UDM is that of mediators between the city and the mountain, Montreal, as the role of their centertown campuses serve the historic preservational needs of the city that surrounds the mountain.
So the University of Montreal has its origins as Laval University, in fact. In 1878, Rome gave the University of Laval in Quebec City its blessing to open a satellite campus in Montreal. The campus was founded with 86 students and 3 faculties, theology, law, and medicine, which were housed variously between the Grand Séminaire de Montréal, Saint-Sulpice, and Château-Ramezzy. In October 1895, the university inaugurated a new building incorporating its faculties in one building. The building could accommodate over 1,000 students and included classrooms, laboratories, a library, a recreation room, and a reception hall. For over 40 years, the university was the center for cultural and social life in the Latin Quarter. However, in November 1919, a fire swept through the main building on Saint-Denis. This is one of the many phases of redevelopment strategies the university has engaged in. The following year, however, the financial burden imposed by this undermined any plans to hire additional professors or purchase equipment. Ernest Cormier was chosen to draw up the plans in 1928 for the university's new campus on land acquired on the northern slope of Montréal in Côte-des-Neiges. Construction did not start until 1930. The Great Depression forced the university to suspend construction of the new buildings. The mounting financial issues compromised not only the new campus, but the existence of the university. Employee salaries had to be suspended several times, and throughout the 1930s, it was widely rumored that the university had considered selling the unfinished project to pay its debts. The government of Quebec adopted an act to assist the university. It led to the creation of a corporate body for University of Montreal that over the following decade acted as the university's owner. In other words, the university was placed under trusteeship, and public power was introduced into the institution's administration. In 1943, after 15 years of work, the university's new home was finally inaugurated, catalyzing the development of more than 30 additional buildings on the mountain campus, including HEC and Polytechnique. the extension, as well as the extension of Metro Line 5 to the campus.
The 1960s Quiet Revolution sparked Quebec nationalism and secularism. Premier Jean Lesage instituted drastic educational reforms which increased public spending on education, created the Cégep and Université du Québec systems, and pushed for a second francophone university, UQAM. UQAM was founded in 1969 through the merger of several schools, including the École des Beaux-Arts de Montréal, among other schools. Concordia University was founded around the same time, in 1974, through the merger of Loyola College, a Jesuit institution situated on the DeCary Farm at NDG, and the Sir George William University, a Protestant school in its current location at Concordia. Both of these universities were established to serve the working class Anglophone communities, with its roots in the church and the YMCA, which was housed in the now demolished Drummond Building. The name was taken from the motto of the city of Montreal, Concordia Salus, meaning well-being through harmony, as part of the greater province-wide project to secularize the education system. And looking at the histories of these four universities, we can see the diverse motivations behind the expansion of these campuses, marking their respective territories in the city. However, in the 21st century, university expansion follows a more singular approach, namely through the mega project.
We recognize that universities build more than mega projects. They are large urban landowners that establish research facilities, build employee and student housing, and construct satellite campuses. We have chosen to focus on urban mega developments because we are interested in how universities, as developers, navigate dense urban environments through large-scale investments, often targeting low-income, deindustrialized neighborhoods for revitalization. It is this promise of urban revitalization, compared with their physical, social, and economic impacts, that we are critically examining.
So how we looked into this was by visiting university archives for primary documents, namely course calendars and annual reports that went back to the inception of the university. And this was really to see how the universities themselves sort of projected themselves, and then also to look at the financials. Stats and figures about Montreal were derived from the 2006 census. In addition to that, we conducted in-person interviews with university archivists, some of the faculty, a student housing group, a community-based housing group, and then a journalist who's written on Montreal's urban development for the past 40 years. A selection of key texts we've referenced are actually listed in the brochure that you should have found on your seats as you came in, and a working glossary that is also within the brochure. Just as a, just to be sort of forthright about some of our limitations on this research, we are mainly Anglophone, non-Montrealers, and this may, in fact, color some of our research and the things that we had access to. Some of the things that we did have difficulty, there were some things that were difficult and even not possible to find. For example, when we were looking at the McGill urban plan, we were told that there were indeed two versions, one that was public and then another that was private, that the public one that was edited of all of sort of the quote-unquote red flags, and the public one was much more innocuous. So we in fact couldn't get our hands on the second version, we just had access to the public one. This information generated some maps, and McGill was probably the most dramatic of these examples. And as it begins, as you can see here, as a very suburban, perhaps even rural entity, and moving forward through the years, we see it begin to operate as an attractor for development. The city crashes upon its borders, and through property donations and purchases, the university then begins to expand back out into the city that grew up beside it. Less dramatically are the other three universities, which also went major expansion in the 50s and 70s. More of the grayscale that you see here is actually representing that 50s to 70s expansion. And you can see here, this is UDM, go forward to UQAM, and then Concordia. And this expansion occurred when public education became a social norm, as previously said, and it coincided with federal and provincial legislation changes like the Provincial Federal Accord, where federal funding for education was devolved to the provincial level?
Our goal with these charts that you see in front of you is to situate the expansion on a backdrop of sociocultural events over nearly 200 years. It reveals the inevitable growth of each institution, supported by primary sources from universities' annual reports, drawn from figures such as student enrollment, revenue, expenditures, and staff employment. The reduction of these figures allows us to glean trends such as the growth of French language universities during historical events like the Cultural Revolution, the amalgamation of institutions with changing attitudes towards secularism, and the rapidly exploding student body, particularly over the past 4 decades. Since 1980, the University of Montreal's student population has more than doubled. Within the 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, there have been over 2,000 additional permanent positions created. Despite the rapid increase in capital investments, operating budgets have remained largely the same over the past decade when adjusted for inflation. The trends revealed are shared amongst all 4 Montreal institutions, where after 40 years of rapid expansion, the institutions are beginning to plateau and enter into a new financial climate characterized by deficits and contentious mega developments. The result manifests itself in growing demands for instructional labor in the form of precarious, non-tenured and sessional lecturers. Meanwhile, these issues are overlaid onto a cultural backdrop that includes a new generation of debt-soaked students, record joblessness, degree saturation, and hyper-credentialism. It could even be argued that the student body represents a new mechanism for property development in the neoliberal market, whereby increasing student enrollment there is a direct equation with more government funding in addition to tuition increases, which enable the expansion of universities through real property. And when huge sums are invested in real estate projects, their purpose, relevance, and ethics must be questioned.
So where are we now? We have now reached a point at which the 4 universities' annual operating and research budgets equal to half of the city's. The university employs more people than the city of Montreal itself, and the student population is nearing 200,000, though this number, due to the declining domestic student population, is projected to plateau or decline in the coming years. So as an employer and an educator of future workforces and economic driver, universities are more important than ever in developing our cities. So we will examine what the implications are of this trend through a case study of each university's mega project development, from the newly proposed to the recently completed.
So our first case study is looking at the University of Montreal's Outremont site. The motivation for developing the Outremont site, which is spatially amputated from the main campus by several kilometers, has originated largely from the demands to accommodate the expansion of disciplines housed in the university. The rapidly expanding student population has called for a spatial fix to deal with these issues. Predating this proposal to expand into the contentious 1.2 square kilometer brownfield bordered by Saint-Laurent and Hutchison Street, north of Rosemont, the University of Montreal acquired a heritage building in 2003, which was intended to respond to the dearth of institutional space. Located at 1420 Montréal, the former convent was purchased at a cost of $15 million by the University of Montreal. Renovations and upgrades have been made by the university with the aid of approximately $20 million granted by the Ministry of Education, Recreation, and Sports. It was sold for the construction of luxury condos at a loss of at least $50 million to Frank Catania, whose links with the mafia were unearthed later at a Charbonneau commission. The University of Montreal maintained that the building is not adapted to their needs due to technical constraints and costs of any renovation. Despite the puzzling fact that 1420 Montréal, located adjacent to the main campus, would certainly satisfy the needs for a geography department and furthermore alleviate the $9 million per year cost of rent for other instructional spaces. Rather than repurposing the space, the university sought an undeveloped space free of constraints. This suggests the Janus-faced institutional expansionary agenda seeking a public-private partnership for development rather than addressing current students and current needs. In 2006, the University of Montreal purchased the land for $18 million to construct a new campus for the university. The estimated cost for preparing the construction site and building the required infrastructure is approximately $120 million, $60 million of which would be coming from the city. The park extension is a small area of approximately 1.2 square kilometers in the heart of the island of Montreal, with a population of approximately 33,000 inhabitants, of which 62% were not born in Canada. Concerns include the gentrification of the area that will accompany an estimated 10,000 students who would be moving here, and the inevitable increase of rent in the area. Supplanting a transient student body into this context would very likely lead to the disintegration of existing social fabrics of the community, which would be required to contend against gentrification. In order to counter the effects of gentrification, it has been recommended that the City of Montreal acquire land to build social housing projects and to ensure the maintenance of lower income households in order to prevent residents from being displaced.
Moving on to Concordia is the Quartier Concordia development, a $350 million master plan by a Cardinal Hardy group based here in Montreal. It was unveiled in 2001, and it saw the creation of 2 new vertical campuses, the Integrated Engineering, Computer Science, and Visual Arts Complex, or the EV Building, and the John Wilson School of Business, both designed by Toronto's KPMG and Montreal's FSA architects. The EV Building sits on the northeast corner of Guy and St. Catherine, on a site that was largely vacant for years, save for the York Theatre, a 1930s Art Deco building that was bought and demolished by Concordia in 2001. The key motivation was to create a town within a town, a unified hub to promote the greening of Mackay Street and to foster connectivity through an intricate network of underground tunnels. This project received a lot of praise from all levels of government for revitalizing the economically depressed west end of St. Catherine Street. In speaking with a longtime journalist in Montreal, he said the former university campus was an embarrassment, that the EV building was respectful, and he appreciated the public commercial space provided on the ground floor of the building. The question that this project raises is, who is the public that this redevelopment serves? In 2006, the Quebec government committed just under $1 million annually to the EV building and the John Wilson School of Business for the purposes of security, and I quote, to protect persons and property given the ease of public access to the downtown buildings, to thereby ward off criminal activity. From a housing perspective, the Concordia development has resulted in a shift from the traditional boarding houses in the area towards private condominiums. In talking to Neighborhood Housing Association, boarding houses are often the alternative for people waiting up to 3 to 4 years for HLM social housing. This also affects the sizable transient Indigenous population who come from northern communities for medical treatment in the city. Quartier Concordia has motivated landlords to sell their property in favor of luxury condo development that is expanding westward along St. Catherine. For example, the Seville at Atwater, where one-bedroom apartment goes for $1,500 to $1,700 a month, twice the rate of existing one-bedroom apartments. So the purported aim of cleaning up the streets has also meant increased surveillance of quasi-public spaces provided by Concordia, which are largely commercial, semi-private, and highly controlled environments, and a resulting increase in harassment of homeless people in the area. This is particularly important when we look at the demographics of the area. As of 2006, 82% of residents rented their homes. About 38% spent more than a third of their household income on rent or property taxes, which surpasses the threshold of affordability. And on average, the annual household income in the area is $9,000 less than the citywide average. Although the Quartier Concordia development brought in significant investment into the downtown and sparked neighboring real estate development, mega projects like this can widen existing socioeconomic disparities, increasing the cost of living, decreasing the available affordable housing stock, and disproportionately affecting low-income residents.
So moving on to the McGill University Health Center, it started with a gentleman named Nicholas Steinmetz, who previously was the director of the Children's Hospital. One day, as the story goes, in '92, while in the shower and considering the state of his hospital's disrepair, he formulated a plan for amalgamating a number of Montreal hospitals, really due to economic pressures, for the stated goal of better service. So this project began in '97 with the amalgamation of initially 5 hospitals and now 6. These hospitals are the Montreal General Hospital, the Royal Vic Hospital, Montreal Children's Hospital, Montreal Neurological Institute, Montreal Chest Institute. In 2008, Hospital de la Chine also joined this alliance. Together they total almost 1,400 beds and well over 18,000 staff. By closing 4 of the 6 institutions and adding a Shriners Hospital for Children Canada, along with North America's premier medical research center, the MUHC stands to be one of the largest and most advanced medical projects in North America. The total budget has grown from $1.3 billion to nearly $2.5 billion, mainly, and this is mainly coming from provincial funds. Only around 10% is coming from private donors. The site of the super hospital is the Glen campus, which borders the boroughs of Westmount and the NDG. At the city's request, this project will not replace critical centrally located hospitals. Instead, those will receive a few upgrades. At its opening, which will be in 2015, the MUHC will boast over 500 individual patient rooms, Canada's largest state-of-the-art medical research facility, and nearly 750,000 square feet just in the Glen campus. The MUHC ranks in the top 10 for publicly funded infrastructure projects in Canada right now. So the motivations for this project really, I guess, would be efficiency in terms of both service and in economics. Vasilios Papadopoulos, who's the director of the MUHC Research Institute, recently stated that by having the MUHC push the boundaries of science, not only does this promote healthcare, but it is a vital contributor to our nation's economy, attracting inquisitive minds and encouraging innovation. He also added that the Research Institute of the MUHC is the largest medical and life science research facility of its kind in Canada and generates almost $100 million in research annually from external sources. So the obvious people who are behind this project are, all 3 levels of government, McGill University, and the developer and project manager SNC-Lavalin, just to mention a few, and the myriad of subsidiaries under that. Critics of this project are numerous and diverse, including administrative corruption, a lack of public consultation, major conflicts of interest in the contractors involved, and budget overruns. Most recently, the corruption charges leveled against former MUHC director Arthur Porter and his wife Pamela. They are being charged with fraud, conspiracy to commit government fraud, abuse of trust, secret commissions, and laundering the proceeds of crime, just to name a few. As a result of Porter's crimes, that's true, there is more in fact. As a result of Porter's crimes, construction unions were forced to fire employees due to the resulting large-scale financial loss of his decisions. Additionally, there was no real public consultation regarding the Glen campus. Although a due diligence committee was formed in regard to the selecting of the space, their role was essentially nil, and they never conducted research or put forward any recommendations. So the potential negative impacts of land pressurization and property value inflation around the Glen campus is not yet fully understood. Regarding conflicts of interest, a U.S. firm who recommended in a report that the existing hospitals, were too expensive to repair, thus needing a new space, also had serious conflict of interest in that they were also bidding for the new building. So how is this legal? And this is not to mention the blatant doubling of the project's budget. So in conclusion, flying under the banner of economic prosperity, education, healthcare, many conflicts in regard to public good have occurred in the rebuilding of the MUHC. So when considering these things in its totality, it's indeed difficult not to question whether this type of mega planning and crony project management be responsible for major parts of our cities, our universities, and even our healthcare system. By using the brand and reputation of high-profile educational institutions as a shroud against criticism, the stakeholders involved essentially have their way. Do these projects contribute to a more just city? The evidence strongly suggests that mega projects such as this may not have the entirely positive consequences for Montreal as its proponents, and who happen to also be the benefactors, suggest.
Finally, we get to UQAM. The UQAM L'Îlot Voyageur project was launched in 2005 as part of a large real estate development struck with Buzac, the real estate developer. The site is bordered by Maisonneuve, Barrie, Ontario, and Saint-Hubert, and was designed to house a multi-purpose research center, offices, classrooms, student residences, a large underground parking facility, and a new bus terminal, which opened in 2011. The construction was halted, however, in 2007 when the cost ballooned to $500 million, which was $200 million over budget. Due to grave mismanagement, for which there are ongoing criminal investigations involving the former rector, the province has had to bail out UQAM for over $250 million. The key motivation behind this project, along with the $200 million Pierre Danzero Science Complex, was to elevate the prestige of UQAM. Although UQAM is maybe not one of the most prestigious of the city's universities, it is arguably the most important to the region's knowledge economy. UQAM has by far the highest percentage of graduates who actually remain in the metropolitan area to live and make their careers. The mismanagement and resulting financial consequences is an example of a failed development project undertaken by a university. Due to the ambitious nature and high-risk nature of these mega projects, when a project fails, the taxpayers must foot the bill, which in the end totaled over $400 million for the whole expansion plan, doing much more social harm than good. It also punishes the students, who have seen tuition increases and cuts to 30 specialized programs. At its height, the university's debt interest was $50,000 a day. Now the university is forced to dip into its operating costs to stay afloat. The site was sold just this past July to Aquilini Group, a real estate developer based in Vancouver, which owns several properties in Montreal. The goal is to build 700 condo units. Since this project, there have been much more provincial oversight over any university-proposed large-scale projects. This project raises important questions about university accountability. As institutions that are predominantly publicly funded, who also fundraise for capital investment and expansion projects, which involve a lot of private dollars, private contracts, and private partnerships, who are the universities accountable to? Especially when it comes to projects that affect every resident of the city. Should universities be taking on the role of the real estate developer? And what should the checks and balances look like?
So universities are developers in the city. They are urban speculators. They are part of a global industry. This project does not aim to provide a model solution for development, but has attempted to raise critical urban questions through case studies of Montreal about how university development proceeds, who are the actors and stakeholders, and likewise, who benefits from these developments and who is negatively impacted. These issues suggest that there are fundamental ethical questions about the role of universities by way of commodification of education and the financial incentives that have emerged by dint of higher education's transformation into an institution dictated by market criteria.
So we all know that revitalization and gentrification are often inextricably linked, ruled by supply and demand and boom and bust cycles. University development brings in another element, studentification. In Montreal, less than 4% of CEGEP and university students not living with their parents live in student housing. Therefore, the vast majority seek out private housing stock in the university's surrounding neighborhoods. Due to the transient nature of students, their specific consumptive patterns, their lack of knowledge of tenant rights and rental hike regulations, the arrival of students in a neighborhood results in inflated rental prices and weakened communities, often pushing out low-income families and residents.
The current reality that drives university expansion can be summarized by Brian Edwards in his book, University Architecture. Image, whether high-tech, multicultural, or green, matters to university, and there's no better way to project an image than through building design. At one level, architecture, urban, and landscape design are the packaging of a service. At another, they are a vehicle whereby intergenerational values are conveyed. For universities with a long lineage, image is already established in stone and concrete. For new universities, however, image is a matter for the fashioning. When the world's universities are seeking to differentiate themselves to avoid global anonymity, at no time since the 19th century have campuses been such a communicator of image and value. Through our research project, we have analyzed the comparative historical growth of development of Montreal's universities and how they have impacted the urban fabric of a city physically, socially, and economically. As there is no such thing as vacant land, university expansion is contingent on the displacement of people and existing programs, which can be met with excitement or resistance from neighboring communities. While framed by the rhetoric of progress and renewal, our research has suggested that megaprojects often contribute to increasing spatial and socioeconomic polarization in urban settings. The pressures of campus expansion in dense and built-up environments raise important questions about contested lands, diverse communities' right to the city, and ultimately, the university's place in the city. Thank you.
Have you heard of McGill has this new project called the Quartier d'Innovation? Have you heard about this?
Is this in Griffintown?
Yeah. Do you know, like, I've heard about it, but maybe do you know anything more? I'm just really interested. I don't know if you've read anything about it. What's in your research?
We certainly looked at the Griffintown project, although we didn't include it in our case studies. But to my knowledge, the Griffintown project is looking at open source and online education. Is this one of its?
I was wondering if it was like a mega project like this. I'm just really not sure. I just heard about it and I'm wondering if it's the same thing.
Can't answer it. I'm not sure.
That's the next project.
Yeah.
It was a really nice presentation and a global view of the universities in Montreal. I missed the beginning, so I just don't know if you said that UQAM was supposed to be built in stone in the beginning, but the short-term administration of things made that it's all made in brick, and it's why it's that ugly today. Luc Ferrandez from Projet Montréal is talking about that example to see how short-term planning can be a big damage for cities. And I just wanted to correct one information. I think the 1420 Montreal of UDM is not sold yet because Catania has been pushed out because of the Commission Charbonneau. And then they're still trying to sell it, but there's a philosophy prof, Michel Seymour, that is trying to fight that decision because the government agreed on the fact that it's going to be from institutional building to private housing. And then, Prof. Michel Seymour is trying to fight that in the Superior Court now. So we don't know about it, what's going to be the decision. And one last thing about UDM, I'm a philosophy student, and the Department of Philosophy is in a really nice historical building. And the same thing is going to happen with that, and all the teachers, the prof, I don't know, half of the department kind of agreed already, the other are not happy about the decision.
I'm sorry, is there a question that we can answer in that?
I thought we were able to discuss and think about the future of the universities in Montreal.
Okay, well, we appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
All right, so I can finish, or?
Okay, sure.
All right. So that historical department is going to be moved in the new one that is going to be built and sell as condos just for the 1420. If it interests you, I thought.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Please, go ahead. So I know that your research was more on the mega developments, but you did touch on this a little bit, the social aspect of the university. And I was just wondering if you had any further findings on the different social campuses, if you will. So depending on, I know McGill is a very international university, meaning that a lot of students come from outside of Canada and outside of the province. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on how the social makeup of the different universities, the demographics, have shaped their surrounding environments.
Well, in terms of the origins of, I think you're maybe making a correlation between where people are from and how maybe that shapes the city.
Yeah, I really am, because you were saying, you mentioned that, you know, when a lot of the UQAM students will actually stay here because many of them have a vested interest in being here. I just wondered if you had any further comment on like the social landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of touched upon it maybe briefly in the presentation, in that, you know, when you get these sort of transient populations coming through, like students who don't necessarily have a vested interest in Montreal and area, and there is a lot of, you know, I think McGill is pushing about a quarter of their population, student population is coming from elsewhere. So the university is then training people to sort of go back to perhaps where they're from or elsewhere, then they're not necessarily staying here. Where that sort of ties into maybe some of Montreal's socioeconomic issues is what we brought up with sort of rent prices and rent costs. That this sort of transients, they don't necessarily have stake here, they're not necessarily aware of the laws and bylaws, especially of, you know, tenant and landlord and these sorts of issues. They can sort of get steamrolled and maybe taken advantage of by certain landowners, and that sort of causes the price to rise for everyone, not just for students, but then even people that have a more permanent stake in the city.
I just wanted to add a quick thing about that. I mean, we didn't look into the specifics of any university in terms of the demographics of the university, but one of the aspects of studentification, which we began to talk about, is the fact that students bring with them also a set of cultural practices, consumptive patterns. So you could see how that's reflected in the type of retail and services that get developed around that student population. So that there is definitely a cultural element, we just haven't looked at them specifically.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that too. Another thing about that is the, you know, how much it costs to go to these certain institutions and the money that students bring in when they come here, and the kind of like elitism and socioeconomic status that can rise up within the institutions themselves. So, that was another thing I was trying to get towards.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and you're totally right about that. I mean, when you look at how students are over 15% of Montreal's population, and that number is growing, you know, that is an industry at that point. And, you know, I did have sort of an informal discussion with a Montreal resident, and he said that, you know, due to different sort of, and I won't necessarily go into all of the things, but he said, you know, different political and different issues, you know, the city has to invest a lot into more education and cultural industries. And to have sort of a direct financial incentive to an educational institution really brings in some sort of ethical questions that I think we're trying to raise tonight. I mean, so you're absolutely right in sort of we're bringing that up. You know, we agree with that.
Well, thanks very much for your presentation, which is a fascinating problem. And I don't know how far this is going to go. It'd be very interesting to see this taken up by the city and discussed. And thanks for this little reminder. The sheet is most helpful. But one thing is, you know, that housing and institution problem. I'm not convinced that the criticism of, for example, Concordia was, I think the problem with Concordia is it doesn't provide any student housing at all. It tried to, it wanted to, but they had a real estate developer help at their committee, and he decided it was just too expensive to do. So this housing, which is on St. Catherine Street, right now that's just being finished, was originally supposed to be student housing, and that didn't happen. But I think that the area had been, of course, quite a fine area before. There's this building here, and it really went down the tube thanks to the city's development of widening boulevard and also some of the very poor housing that was built, high-rise housing in the 70s. But so I don't think that and the building itself, actually, there was more of a public process. There was certainly the architect, there was a concours for the architects, and that also there were public hearings on the second building going out. I guess there must have been on the first also, after it was done. But I think it probably ends up being more positive in the area than negative. But I think that the lack of housing is, for students, I think that the point is very well taken and it's problematic. I'm not sure, the Université de Montréal provides very little. Of course, McGill provides a huge amount. It provides up every hotel in the area and makes it in the students' housing. So have you been able to sort of get some sense of, and I don't think you can as any, well, we know where there was to be a little bit of that part. So what about in your analysis of each of these places, which are in different parts of the city, did you have time to be able to kind of analyze what were the pros and the cons of this kind of effect on the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think the point you raised about universities not building student housing is a really good one, including some people in the room here who do their work primarily around advocating for student housing. So one of the statistics that's on there is that there's about approximately 5,200 student housing units here in the city. So as we said, as the numbers are approaching 200,000 students, you can see how minimal the university provided housing is. And as well, a lot of the new projects that have been done, for instance, like the hotels that are being bought up, are geared towards more luxury condominium-style student housing. So that's where rentals can begin at somewhere $1,200 a month, which for a lot of people is not at all affordable. But it's definitely a large issue, and maybe some people in the audience are much more.
In many countries, many places, the United States, Britain, rich parents from abroad buy apartments, condos for the children. I don't have student applicants.
Yeah, I can answer some of these questions. I'm from Cette, which is a community group that argues and develops student housing. One of the things we're seeing in Montreal is not only reduced development of student housing by universities, but also a larger role that's being played by private investors. The most recently being the Delta Hotel being sold off to an American developer who is planning to build over 1,000 luxury beds there. This, of course, also brings up some of the questions that were brought up by this very interesting presentation, by the way, as to what role the universities have to play and what roles are they not playing, and what roles are other people starting to play, and are they playing them better or worse than the universities are doing. What we're seeing is, as said, is that the student housing that's being developed, that has been developed in the last 5 to 10 years in Montreal, is exclusively in the upper branch of the spectrum in terms of rent, luxury, and so forth and so forth. And another question that this raises that I wanted to bring forward is the question of where to put the students, and whether student housing should be on campus or off campus. And in the past, a lot of development has been on campus, in this sort of the idea of the university as a city. And it's interesting, by the way, because there's been a big debate in the New York Times recently on this that was asking the question whether on-campus housing and off-campus housing have an impact on the quality of the academic experience. I don't think that's the point tonight. I think it's more interesting to analyze it from an urban perspective, whether on-campus and off-campus housing have positive or negative impacts on the environment. We believe that on-campus housing is better than nothing, because you're housing students that otherwise would be hastening gentrification on the neighboring environments. However, off-campus housing has many positive impacts that have been showcased by literature noticeably a better integration between the student population and its neighborhood and its environment, and a better dialogue between the institutions themselves and their urban environments through the fact that people are more interested in the city they live in and not just in the university they study in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes?
So I know like UCAM recently, that's kind of a question more for you maybe because you seem to know more about this, but UCAM's recent buildings are affordable, I think, right? Their goal is to be affordable, the new residences, versus McGill's are very expensive. So there's a university mission of McGill to like make more money and pay off its debts kind of thing, whilst UCAM seems to have more of a social calling, maybe. And I'm wondering if that's the case.
Well, the most recent buildings, the residences built by UQAM are from 2005, and they are arguably affordable. They're certainly way more affordable than McGill residences. We're looking at $450 to $550 a month for a room. You also have to think about the demographics that are targeted. UQAM is catering to mostly Quebec students, mostly students from the region, who are comparing this way more easily with the rents on the private sector, whereas students at McGill are much more international, which have a higher wealth profile generally speaking, and we'll be comparing to the student housing market in other big cities, where it's obviously way higher and way more expensive than Montreal. Montreal having a much lower average rent than other, for example, North American cities of the same size.
Did you do any comparative analysis with other urban situations in which universities have a quantitative role similar to the one of Montreal and today? And did you do any, how can I say, historical analysis on the issues? Because starting from the 60s, different kind of strategies have been put in place in respect to the role of universities and cities. And how can I say, universities have been used very often in order to develop a requalification process inside the cities with a lot of public intervention, not university intervention, in order to control perhaps the inevitable effect of this kind of process. Because that could be very interesting understanding of possible alternative strategies or issues that could be.
I think some of the things we looked at, unfortunately maybe not as many historical examples that we would have liked, but there has been, we've gone to the literature to look at what some of contemporary cities are also going through. So a really high profile project has been Columbia University's expansion that was proposed in 2007 to a 17-acre site to expand into West Harlem or Manhattanville. So this has kind of come across a lot of controversy around the rezoning of the area and also the threat of what is called eminent domain or expropriation of lands there. So we did look at some current universities and how they've also gone down the route of kind of a master plan of long-term mega projects. So that's one example.
I was saying, for example, more than university, cities, because, for example, Boston is a city which has, in terms of percentage of student population, a little bit more than Montreal. Montreal, I think, is the second and the third in terms of a percentage of students on the urban context. Could be nice to compare the impact of students' population in the urban phenomena, analyzing the presence of students in terms of percentage. Anyway, you have time to do that.
As I was saying, maybe this is something that could be taken up at this project.
By the next year's.
Yeah, by the next year, by the.
But we should also not forget about Chicago as well, with IIT, University of Illinois in Chicago, the campus, and how it was expansion of the university within Chicago was it was met with as a response to dealing with urban problems, dealing with urban blight. So I mean, it was seen as a catalyst to deal with these urban issues. And so I guess this is a more rounded, enveloping the issue of city development with university development as well, especially with the case of Chicago.
Well, the University of Chicago and IIT, I know really intimately, and the IIT especially was a huge problem. It was in a slum area, one of the deepest, darkest slum areas in the United States. And they decided to stay there because they couldn't afford to go anywhere else. But what happened was that it became a socially very strong idea of building the campus, which of course was an avant-garde idea of how to build a campus. And then also the hospitals were right next door to it, and so expanding those hospitals. And then also building a fascinating, very good housing area for integrated housing, which is really not at all really done in Chicago. So that started off as I would say, a very positive approach to planning, which I don't know of any of the other. I mean, here in Montreal it's all haphazard, and no, none of this. Are there any other places? And of course, you mentioned the Columbia thing, which is a huge problem, and it's not going to be positive in that kind of a way. I don't know of any other place. I mean, you sort of go back to University of Virginia as an idealistic place, but that had that kind of social urban planning that was, really thought through as the Chicago situation, IIT especially. Can you think of any others?
But I think it is what you said, missing from the motivation of a university, as you mentioned in Chicago, to stay because they couldn't afford to go anywhere else, while the motivation nowadays quite often is to invest and to earn back a lot of money, which is a total different motivation for whatever you do. So it starts with that. Obviously.
Yeah, I was, just wanted to raise the point here. I mean, not necessarily answering directly this question of comparing to other cities, but, I think perhaps a big, maybe one of the issues here in Montreal is that although there is a bylaw that states that 15% of, maybe some of the people here are more familiar with that, but 15% of these large-scale developments has to go to social housing. There is an opt-out clause in that, where they can sort of take that money and actually put it into sort of a nebulously determined city fund that isn't necessarily clearly defined on where that is and what that goes for. And we think that this is perhaps an area that could be looked at. And then to also say that I think the overarching idea in this is that what we're seeing, the trend, not just in Montreal, but even in some of these examples elsewhere, is that this idea of the mega project is sort of being built out with the notions of efficiency and solving a lot of problems, but that there's a lot of negative unintended consequences to it that really need to be looked at, and in part is due to the fact that there probably isn't very good public consultation, and I know that's a very laborious process, but that also is another hole that we've sort of identified, at least in a lot of the projects that we looked at and elsewhere.
Yeah, this makes me wonder whether these projects of those universities can be labeled social projects, as the universities were earlier, and if they're not some people's projects, like the projects of the dean. Yeah. Yeah, like engineering.
Absolutely. I mean, there is totally a legacy motivation, legacy building motivation in a lot of these projects too.
But my question was whether the motivations when the university, for example, when the two Concordia and UQAM were built within the 60s, they weren't real estate projects, they weren't investments, were they? Weren't they? My question is whether they were social projects that mobilized the population as a whole and were expected to have mostly positive impacts.
Well, I'm sure definitely it is. I mean, maybe Nick has some thoughts on this as well, but I would say though that when the provincial government started to make a direct correlation between student numbers and the funding that they received, which did begin to occur sort of in the mid to late 50s and early 60s, I mean, that incentivizes construction and expansion, largely probably due to economic reasons. I mean, you can't necessarily, that might not be all of it, but it certainly introduces that incentive. And we cannot sort of deny that reality that exists there of finance and the growth of the university, which is inextricably linked between the funding policy and student numbers.
I'd like to add something there, that it was only at that period that the developers started to say that the bottom line was the important thing. And before that just didn't exist. You build a building, you got some money out of it, but with the kind of Harvard Business School, idea of economics, that changed radically in the private sector. At the same time, which I just find a very interesting correlation, and it's the state of mind that changed.
Yeah, it was interesting. So sort of the way you presented everything made me forget that you're all studying architecture. You sort of sounded like social historians, which is really refreshing actually to hear. And it made me think about how you're mobilizing, it's sort of like a media question, how you're mobilizing this whole sort of interconnected maybe ecosystem of information to convince us of something. And so maybe I want to ask all of you to reflect a little bit on like how this sort of data project as a form of advocacy or analysis, like how it maybe like not informs your practice, but how it informs how you think about these questions maybe.
Yeah, I think all of us are coming from a similar viewpoint where we would define cities as people primarily. And as such, architecture is sort of a manifestation of our relationships and sort of social values. And I think that's primarily our approach to architecture. And we fundamentally believe that if architecture is to engage or enable or resist some of these societal forces, being primarily a social construct, then architects need to be aware of this stuff and be deliberate in their decision, understand the consequences of built space and what forces they're channeling and how they're doing that. And architecture isn't just a technical problem to be solved, nor is it a means of financial gain, a vehicle for financial gain. It is, I think, primarily a social issue. It needs to be engaged primarily in that way, and we don't really see a lot of evidence of that. So I think this attempt is trying to broaden the definition and to perhaps inspire that sort of a popularity of that viewpoint.
And I think actually this is kind of connected to Phyllis's point about a change in mindset. It probably has to do with the corporatization of the university. And I think the approach of using kind of the data, the numbers, the statistics, is also using the language that the universities are using to present themselves, and through that language actually revealing something that may be a little bit more sinister, a little bit more less innocuous. So there's definitely an intention of why we framed it as such. It's almost like we're giving a financial report of the universities.
We have a 200-year annual report here of all the universities in Montreal. So, but I think that part of the representational strategy in using statistics and using data is to kind of kind of mirror the same rhetoric that is used in the same sort of language that most of the universities are using now. So that was kind of one of our attempts as well.
So I have like two questions. One of them is, I wasn't really clear. I know the MUHC is a P3, but how many of these mega projects are P3s? And like in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world, is this like a big trend? Like these private-public partnerships and like kind of like it's actually a good segue, like the corporatization of university. How big of a trend is this? Is there any pushback against it? So that's like one part. And the second part is, I'm wondering in your research if you read any, because I know there's a lot of public policy think tanks, and I know that there's like these really posh you know, senior administration bureaucrat type of magazines that get like passed around. I know that there's a lot of think tanks, and I know that university administrators are reading this. I'm wondering if you read any of that, if that kind of, there's a kind of discourse in the, you know, the administrative class of universities, like that kind of reflects kind of like what your research is, and whether they see it as like a positive thing, like those two things. I'm wondering, yeah.
That's a really great question, and I think we could have probably done a presentation just looking at the dynamics of P3s. And I think it's part of a larger trend that we're seeing, not just unique to the universities, but government seeking out public-private partnerships for providing essential services. So, I mean, I think, I don't think we particularly focused on the partnership aspects of it because this was a more of an urban analysis, but I think there is something that is really kind of endemic to the ways.
Were all these projects, how many of them were P3s? So I know the MUHC definitely was, but the others.
Well, for sure the MUHC was. I mean, I think the other ones were perhaps more sort of university spearheaded projects. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's the case.
And then, okay, so I guess.
But it's probably the most recent as well. I mean, and that is a trend, you know, obviously in the age of austerity, you know, this is sort of the organizational structure of a lot of new developments that a lot of them.
And I know that as well the UQAM was also P3. I mean, it was, the intention was BUSAC would own or have property and would lease it to UQAM for 30 years, after which point then the university would own it. So that was part of the agreement. Obviously none of that has come through at all.
And the magazine thing? Did you, in your research, did you go through any of that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, I think largely we looked at, you know, what the university was saying, how they were presenting it, contrasting that to sort of the financials, and then also looking at, you know, what the community was saying by trying to reach out and connect, and even some of you here in this room. So it was sort of comparing those two vantage points, I think, you know, for us. Now, in terms of, you know, business management magazines or the discussion on how to monetize education or this sorts of things, I don't think we did a sort of an exhaustive, you know, analysis of that. It was more contrasting those two viewpoints of what the official presentation was of the projects to then sort of what was the response of that on sort of street level.
It'd be interesting if you're going to continue this research to kind of look at like the business, like the managers kind of like mega project discourse.
The CCA would provide another brand for Danielle, Nicolas, and John. Go ahead.
It's really interesting stuff, yeah.
And regarding that question, actually, I just realized that the closest we have in here was it's in here somewhere, but it's something called, oh yes, the Initiative for Competitive Inter-City Leveraging Colleges and Universities for Urban Economic Development. And so it was a grouping of different universities, and they came under the heading of CEOs for cities. And so they came out with the publication that we did refer to in terms of, that was definitely coming from the mindset of how to leverage universities as developers, essentially.